Alright, hey, it's Mr. Richards, and I'm going to be talking about building materials this week, and we are going to start with wood. Now, first of all, there's a lot of information here, so if you just want the basics, like you're okay with getting a 2, maybe even a 3, you can skip to the very end to the TLDR slide, that's too long, didn't read, which is just the basic overview. So, wood, it comes from trees. Trees are shaped kind of like this, usually. And when we build stuff using wood, we need boards that are shaped like this. So in order to get there, we have to cut the trees down and then cut up the trunks of the trees into board shapes. And then we can use those boards to build the framing of buildings. All right. Now, lumber in general is used to build smaller buildings. So buildings that usually have between 1, 2, or 3 stories would be really common to be built out of lumber. Anything more than 3 stories or 3 floors is usually going to be built with steel. Now, when we use wood for building, we call it lumber, okay? And lumber comes from forests. Now, there's 2 different types of forests that lumber can come from. Lumber can come from forests that are planted by humans, that the trees are planted and the intention is to harvest the lumber just like you would with corn or soybeans, like in a farm. And then the other option is that lumber can come from natural forests. So if there's a natural forest that exists, humans can go in and cut trees down. Now, it's really important to remember that trees take a long time to grow, usually more than 10 years or so. And so it's really important not to cut down more trees than we allow to grow, all right? And that's been a big issue in the United States and especially in South America when we're talking about rainforests. Humans have not done a very good job of conserving natural forests. But if wood is harvested correctly, it can be a renewable resource. And the great thing about wood is that wood and trees are actually grown and made out of the carbon that is in the air. So trees remove carbon from the atmosphere, which is really good because we have too much carbon in the atmosphere right now. So here's a picture of a lumber farm. You'll notice that it's different than a natural forest, and I'll point some of the differences out. First of all these trees are the same species. Next, they're not growing randomly, but they're growing in straight rows. And finally, the trunks of these trees do not have branches that are growing out of the side of them. And that is because, the people that grow these lumber farms actually cut the branches off. And what that does is it causes the trees to grow taller and a little bit skinnier, and it leaves the trunk free of branches. Now, the issues with this, you might look at this and think, wow, how different is this from a natural forest? And the difference is there's no biodiversity. So, and there's very little habitat because it would be very difficult for animals to live in these trees. So even though you're looking at a lot of trees, this type of lumber farm does not support very much other kinds of life. So it's not a good idea to cut down a natural forest and plant one of these in its place. All right, so there's lots of different kinds of trees. When you look outside, you will see trees that look different from each other. And that means that there are different species of trees. But we can make it simpler by putting them into 2 main groups. And the first group I'm going to talk about are called hardwoods. And hardwoods are usually found in natural forest. They usually take a long time to grow. So I'm talking about 20 to 30 years to become like full size, and they can live for much longer than that, 200-300 years. And they have leaves. So all of the trees that you see outside that have their leaves turning different colors right now and the leaves are falling, those are hardwood trees, and the technical name for them is deciduous, and that's that word right here. Now, some names of really common deciduous hardwoods are oak, maple, ash, walnut, and there's a ton of other ones. Now, the thing about hardwoods, because they take longer to grow, they're also a lot heavier than softwoods, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, means that they're really expensive. And because we need a lot of wood to build a house, we usually do not use hardwoods for the actual building. We leave hardwoods for building furniture out of. Now, softwoods are trees with needles, and the technical name for them is coniferous trees. Now, they grow a little bit faster, and some common examples or common names are fir, spruce, and pine trees. And pine is going to be the most common used wood in building, especially in the northern part of the United States. Now, construction lumber has to be different sizes. You'll notice here in this pile that we have on the top, we have narrower boards, and at the bottom we have wider boards, all right? And we have different uses. For example, these walls where the pieces of wood are stood up on their end don't need super wide boards. However, when we're talking about the floors or the ceilings, and we're going to learn about beams in a minute, we're going to be using the wider pieces of wood because the wider pieces are stronger. Now, like I said, construction lumber is usually pine, and here's the kind of tricky part. Construction lumber comes in nominal sizes, and it's called dimensional lumber. And this is tricky because we call them like a 2x4, which stands for 2 inches thick by 4 inches wide, and then, however long you need it. Or a 2x6, 2x8, and we call that dimensional lumber or 2x lumber. But the actual size of the lumber is different. So if I take a 2x4 and actually measure it, it's actually going to be closer to 1.5 inches thick by 3.5 inches wide. But we still call them 2x4s because it's a lot easier to say 2x4 than 1.5 by 3.5. And the reason, if you're interested, why we call them 2x4s is because when they take the tree and cut the tree into boards, the size is actually going to be 2 inches thick by 4 inches wide. But trees have a lot of water in them, and so when the water dries out, it's like a sponge and the boards shrink. And then once they've shrunk, they take those boards and they make them smooth on all sides. That removes a little bit more material, and so we're left with 1.5 inches thick by 3.5 inches wide. Now, construction lumber also has grades, all right? And we'll start at the top here and work our way from the highest grade down to the lowest grade. And in general, a higher grade is stronger and more expensive. The lower grade is not quite as strong, but a lot cheaper. So our top grade is called select straight grained. Okay, so when you look at this piece of wood, it looks very uniform. Okay, there's not a whole lot of little dark spots in it, and this is a very strong piece of wood. The next lower grade is number 1. You can see more spots in it. Okay, these are technically called knots, and it's much easier to see with a number 2 grade. Now, number 2 is the most commonly used construction lumber out there. So it's very common, number 2. And number 2, you'll notice that the edges can be a little rough. You'll see knots, and a knot is really where a branch is growing out of the trunk. So this branch has been cut off, and what's left over is a knot. So there's more knots in it. Okay, the grain or these little lines in it is not very regular. It's not as straight as the select piece of wood. But it's still pretty strong. And then your number 3 is the cheapest. It's got a lot of knots. It's really rough on the outside. It's not very strong, but it is really, really cheap. Generally speaking, when we talk about construction lumber, we're going to be talking about number 2 graded lumber. Now, you might, if you've ever been to a hardware store like Home Depot or Menards or Lowe's, and you look at the wood, you'll see that it has a stamp on it. And this stamp tells you everything you need to know about the lumber. It first tells you what the company is that made it. I don't know what this stands for, but this is the company that cut the wood down and milled it to size. We have the year that it was cut down, so this is cut down in 2009. We have the grade, so this is a grade 1 or a number 1, like we see here, it's number 1. So that 1 stands for. Then we have the treatment. Now this is interesting because you can cut down a tree and let the wood sit outside and dry out and shrink like a sponge, like I said earlier, or you can take that wood and you can put it in a big furnace or a big oven and heat it up so it's nice and warm, and that will cause it to dry out much faster, usually in a couple of hours. So this stands for kiln dried, so it means it was heated up in an oven to dry it out. And this HT stands for heat treated, and that heat treatment causes any bugs or eggs of bugs that were living in this wood to be killed, because you probably don't want to be using wood to build with that has like termite or ant eggs inside of it. That would not be good. So kiln dry, heat treated to kill off anything that's living in it. Down here, this is the National Lumber Grading Association. That's just the governing body that grades this lumber. It's a standard that they use, like we have our grading standard at Farnsworth. That's kind of what this is. And then this is the species of the tree. So this is in the group SPF for spruce, pine, and fir. So these are all lumped together, basically saying that a 1 graded SPF or spruce, pine, fir piece of wood is a certain strength. Okay, and we'll be talking about strength in our lesson on Thursday. So here's your TLDR. Most homes and small buildings are made out of wood. Wood can be a renewable resource, and the wood that we use to build buildings is usually pine, spruce, or fir. These are all coniferous trees or trees with needles. They grow faster than hardwoods, so we call them softwoods. We call it construction lumber, and construction lumber comes in different sizes and grades. So on Thursday this week, we'll be getting into how we build buildings and how we know what size of wood to use in order to make a building strong enough. So look for that video on Thursday. All right, that's it for today. Everybody take care, and remember, you can always come see me during office hours from 2:30 until 4 at FAUS Richards. Also, you can send me an email if you have a quick question and don't want to show up to office hours. All right, take care, everybody.